August 4th, 1914, 8:00 a.m. The morning mist clings to the rolling green hills of Gemmenich. Just across the Belgian border, Captain Otto von Stockhausen tightens his grip on the reins of his horse as he watches the column of field-grey uniforms surge forward like an unstoppable tide. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and the nervous sweat of thousands of men and horses moving in unison toward the unknown. Dust kicks up in choking clouds under the rhythmic stomp of jackboots, while the metallic clatter of Mauser rifles and bayonets creates a deafening, industrial symphony of war that drowns out the birdsong. This is not a drill, but the first terrifying step of the Schlieffen Plan. Back in Berlin, the mood was delirious with a patriotic fever that swept through the boulevards and beer halls like a contagion. Crowds of young men threw flowers at marching soldiers, convinced that they were embarking on a glorious adventure that would reaffirm German dominance over the continent. They boarded trains chalked with slogans promising a return home before the leaves fell, oblivious to the industrial slaughter that awaited them. The Kaiser had told them they would be back before the leaves turned brown, a promise that bolstered their spirits as they left their families weeping with pride on the platforms. It was a moment of supreme national confidence, a collective hallucination that masked the grave risks their leaders were taking. The strategy driving these men forward had been crafted years ago by the late Count Alfred von Schlieffen to solve Germany's greatest nightmare of a two-front war. The logic was cold and precise in its demand for speed, requiring the German First Army to function like a massive hammer swinging through neutral Belgium to crush France before the Russian bear could mobilize in the east. General Helmuth von Moltke, the man now charged with executing this grand design, sat in his headquarters miles away, his brow furrowed with anxiety as he tracked the timetables that dictated every train movement and infantry march with unforgiving rigidity. He knew that any deviation from the schedule could spell disaster for the entire campaign. The logistical undertaking required to move millions of men and their equipment was unprecedented in human history. Thousands of trains ran with clockwork precision, dumping corps after corps at the border railheads, where they transitioned from the mechanical speed of the locomotive to the grueling pace of the march. Quartermasters struggled to calculate the tonnage of fodder required for the horses and the ammunition needed for the artillery, numbers that grew astronomically with every mile advanced. The roads of Belgium were soon clogged with endless columns of supply wagons, field kitchens, and heavy guns, creating a traffic jam that stretched back to the Rhine and threatened to strangle the advance before it truly began. Expectations of a swift and unhindered passage through Belgium evaporated almost immediately as the fortress city of Liège refused to surrender. General Otto von Emmich stood before the massive concrete forts that ringed the city, watching in frustration as his light artillery shells bounced harmlessly off the reinforced armor cupolas. The delay was agonizing for the German High Command, who watched the precious hours tick away on the clock of their grand strategy. The Belgian defenders fought with a tenacity that the Germans had foolishly discounted, using their machine guns to mow down wave after wave of attackers who advanced in close order formation. The fields outside Liège were soon carpeted with the field-grey bodies of German youth. It took the arrival of the monstrous Big Bertha siege howitzers, dragged by tractors and oxen, to finally crack the Belgian defences. These steel leviathans were the secret weapon of the German arsenal, hurling 1-ton shells that shattered the concrete forts and signaled to the world that the age of traditional fortifications was over. When the shells impacted, the explosions were so powerful that they shattered the eardrums of the defenders inside and collapsed the tunnel systems. The surrender of the forts allowed the German tide to flow once again, but the timetable had been disrupted, and the psychological cost of the unexpected resistance weighed heavily on the commanders. As the German armies pushed deeper into Belgium, a dark paranoia began to take hold among the rank and file. Stories of franc-tireurs, or civilian snipers, spread like wildfire through the regiments, leading to brutal reprisals against the local population. Innocent villages were burned to the ground, and civilians were executed in town squares as the German commanders sought to terrify the populace into submission. This brutality, dubbed the Rape of Belgium by the Allied press, galvanized international opinion against Germany and provided the British propaganda machine with powerful ammunition. The moral high ground was lost in the ashes of libraries and homes, painting the Germans as barbaric Huns in the eyes of the world. By the time the German armies collided with the French along the borders, the scale of the violence escalated to horrifying new heights. During the Battle of the Frontiers, French infantry charged across open fields in their bright red trousers, guided by an obsolete doctrine that emphasized spirit over firepower. German machine gunners watched in disbelief as the French soldiers walked into their kill zones, cutting them down by the thousands in a single afternoon. The casualty lists were staggering, with over 27,000 French soldiers killed in a single day. Yet the German advance continued relentlessly, pushing the shattered remnants of the French armies backward. However, the British Expeditionary Force soon made its presence known at the Battle of Mons, complicating the German advance on the right flank. Although small in number compared to the Continental armies, the British professionals were highly trained marksmen who could fire their Lee-Enfield rifles with such speed and accuracy that the Germans believed they were facing machine guns. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck was forced to pause and deploy heavy artillery to dislodge the stubborn British defenders. While the British eventually retreated, their delaying action bought precious time for the French to regroup and withdraw south toward the Marne. The subsequent pursuit, known as the Great Retreat, tested the physical limits of the German soldier to the breaking point. The summer heat of August became an enemy as formidable as the Allies, baking the roads until the marching infantrymen hallucinated from exhaustion. Soldiers of the First Army marched upwards of 30 miles a day, their feet blistered and bleeding inside their jackboots. Often sleeping while they walked, they fought skirmish after skirmish, always pushing forward, fueled by the adrenaline of victory and the desperate belief that one final push would encircle Paris and end the war before the autumn leaves fell. Horses died in their harnesses by the thousands, leaving artillery pieces stranded and reducing the army's mobility. As the supply lines stretched thinner and thinner, the soldiers began to run out of food and ammunition, forced to scavenge from the countryside. The meticulously planned logistics system broke down under the speed of the advance, unable to keep up with the infantry who were outrunning their railheads. Commanders were forced to make decisions based on outdated intelligence. As communication wires were cut or left behind, the cohesion of the German offensive began to fracture, with individual armies drifting apart as they chased the retreating Allies. The unified sledgehammer that Schlieffen had envisioned was turning into a disjointed series of blows that lacked the knockout power required to win the war. A critical gap eventually opened between von Kluck's First Army and von Bülow's Second Army, a tactical vulnerability born of exhaustion and miscommunication. General von Kluck, aggressive and impatient, turned his army southeast to roll up the French line, ignoring orders to stay west of Paris. This maneuver exposed his right flank to the garrison of Paris and created a 30-mile hole in the German line. In the gloomy rooms of the Supreme Army Command, Moltke felt his confidence shattering as reports from the front became sporadic and confused. He feared that the French were not fleeing in panic but were instead gathering their strength for a massive counterstroke. His fears were confirmed when the military governor of Paris, General Gallieni, spotted the exposed flank and convinced the French commander-in-chief Joseph Joffre to attack. The Allies launched their counter-offensive along the River Marne, catching the Germans off guard. In a desperate move to ferry troops to the front, the French commandeered hundreds of Paris taxicabs to rush reinforcements to the battlefield. The sight of these taxis, packed with soldiers, arriving at the front lines boosted French morale and symbolized the total mobilization of the nation. The German commanders, who had believed victory was days away, were suddenly fighting for their survival. The Battle of the Marne erupted with a ferocity that stunned both sides, shattering the silence of the French countryside with the roar of 1,000,000 guns. General Joffre ordered his men to die where they stood rather than retreat another inch, and the exhausted German advance finally hit a wall of steel and fire. The German soldiers, who had marched hundreds of miles, were now forced to fight a fresh and determined enemy. The gap between the German armies became a death trap as the British Expeditionary Force advanced into the void, threatening to encircle and destroy von Kluck's isolated forces. The tactical brilliance of the German army could not overcome the strategic disaster unfolding on the map. Realizing the catastrophe at hand, a staff officer named Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hench was sent by Moltke to visit the army commanders and assess the situation. Seeing the exhaustion of the troops and the danger of encirclement, Hench authorized a general retreat, a decision that would remain controversial for decades. The order to pull back was met with shock and disbelief by officers who could see the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Yet the reality of their logistical collapse left them no choice. The German First and Second Armies began the grim march north to the high ground along the Aisne River. The retreat marked the death of the Schlieffen Plan and the end of the War of Movement. The dream of a 6-week victory died in the mud of the riverbanks, replaced by the grim realization that the war would not end by Christmas. Moltke, broken by the stress and the failure of the campaign, reportedly told the Kaiser, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." He was soon relieved of command, a scapegoat for a plan that was perhaps doomed from the start by its own complexity. The German army had gambled everything on a swift knockout blow, and having failed, they now faced a long war they were ill-equipped to sustain. As the autumn rains began to fall, the mobile war ground to a bloody halt along the Aisne. Soldiers on both sides grabbed shovels and entrenching tools, frantically digging into the earth to escape the storm of machine gun fire and shrapnel. What began as shallow foxholes soon connected into elaborate systems of trenches, protected by barbed wire and machine gun nests. The race to the sea followed, as both sides tried to outflank each other to the north, but every attempt was met with a new line of defensive ditches. A jagged scar of earth began to stretch from the Swiss border to the North Sea. By the end of 1914, the illusion of a short, glorious war had been thoroughly shattered. Millions of men were now locked into a stalemate that no general knew how to break, facing each other across a desolate no-man's land. The German Empire found itself trapped in the very vice it had tried to avoid, surrounded by enemies and condemned to a war of attrition. The conflict had transformed from a battle of maneuver into a gruesome test of industrial endurance. The soldiers settled into the mud, freezing and miserable, as the first Christmas of the war approached, marking the beginning of a tragedy that would consume an entire generation. By the spring of 1915, the Western Front had calcified into a continuous, festering wound stretching from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. The War of Movement was a distant memory, replaced by a troglodytic existence where men lived like rats in labyrinthine ditches carved into the clay and chalk. The German soldier, once trained for glorious sweeping maneuvers, now found himself knee-deep in freezing mud, battling lice, trench foot, and the constant, unnerving sniper fire that punished the slightest curiosity. The landscape itself had been murdered, the trees reduced to splintered toothpicks, and the fields churned into a cratered moonscape where the unburied dead of previous assaults slowly sank into the slime. In an attempt to break this maddening deadlock, the German High Command authorized a terrifying escalation in the methods of warfare near the Belgian town of Ypres. On a warm April afternoon in 1915, specialist troops from the pioneer regiments cracked open thousands of metal canisters, releasing a drifting cloud of chlorine gas toward the Allied lines. German infantry followed cautiously behind this greenish-yellow fog, wearing primitive cotton pads over their mouths, watching as the gas sank into the enemy trenches. The result was a scene from hell, as French colonial troops and Canadian soldiers clawed at their throats, drowning on dry land as their lungs filled with fluid, their panic creating a gap in the line that the Germans were too surprised to fully exploit. Despite the introduction of chemical warfare, the strategic stalemate persisted throughout 1915, forcing General Erich von Falkenhayn to rethink the fundamental nature of the conflict. He concluded that a traditional military breakthrough was no longer possible against the deep defensive belts of the enemy. Instead, he conceived a grim, calculative strategy based on the cold arithmetic of attrition, aiming to bleed the French army to death. He needed a target so symbolically important that the French High Command would be compelled to throw every available man into its defense, sacrificing them to German artillery. His finger landed on the map at the ancient fortress city of Verdun, a place he vowed would become the anvil upon which the French army would be smashed. The operation was code-named Gericht, meaning judgment, reflecting the biblical scale of destruction Falkenhayn intended to unleash. Throughout the winter, German engineers worked in absolute secrecy to stockpile millions of artillery shells and position over 1,000 guns in the woods surrounding the Verdun salient. The logistical build-up was a masterpiece of German organization, constructing new rail lines and concrete bunkers to house the assault troops who waited in the freezing dampness. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the silence of the forest was shattered by the most intense artillery bombardment the world had ever seen. A storm of steel that erased the French front lines in seconds. For 9 hours, the German guns hammered the French positions with a relentless trommelfeuer, or drum fire, that churned the earth until geography itself became unrecognizable. When the barrage finally lifted, German stormtroopers emerged from their bunkers, armed with grenades and flamethrowers, expecting to find nothing but corpses. Instead, they found dazed but determined pockets of French survivors who fought back with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. The battle for Verdun quickly devolved into a savage, close-quarters brawl for every inch of scorched ground. The capture of the massive Fort Douaumont, taken almost by accident by a small group of German soldiers, was hailed as a great victory in Berlin, but it was merely the opening act of a tragedy. As weeks turned into months, Verdun transformed into a blast furnace that consumed the youth of both nations with insatiable hunger. The battlefield was a nightmare of mud and blood, where shell craters overlapped and the smell of rotting flesh was inescapable. German soldiers rotated into the sector, described it as the bone mill, a place where entire battalions evaporated under the ceaseless rain of high explosives. The French, under General Philippe Pétain, organized a lifeline known as the Voie Sacrée, a single road along which thousands of trucks poured fresh men and supplies into the inferno. The German strategy of attrition was working, but it was a double-edged sword. For every 2 Frenchmen killed, Germany lost a man they could not easily replace. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the slaughter at Verdun, the British Army prepared a massive relief offensive further north along the River Somme. General Douglas Haig believed that a massive artillery barrage would cut the German barbed wire and destroy the defenders in their dugouts, allowing his cavalry to ride through into the open country. For 7 days and nights, the German defenders on the Somme endured a hurricane of shelling that shook the ground like an earthquake, deep in their reinforced concrete dugouts, 30 feet below the chalk. The German machine gunners played cards and waited, their nerves frayed but their weapons safe from the destruction raining down above. On the morning of July 1, 1916, the British shelling stopped, and a sudden, eerie silence fell over the cratered valley. The German sentries rushed up the dugout stairs, dragging their heavy Maxim machine guns into position amidst the ruins of their trenches. Through the periscopes, they saw an unbelievable sight, wave after wave of British infantry walking slowly across no man's land in extended lines. Rifles held across their chests. The British artillery had failed to cut the wire, and the infantry were bunching up at the gaps, presenting perfect targets. The German gunners opened fire, their machine guns traversing back and forth, cutting down the advancing rows like a scythe through wheat. That single day resulted in nearly 60,000 British casualties, a defensive triumph for the German army. But the battle was far from over. The Somme offensive dragged on for months, transforming into a material Schlacht, or battle of material, where the industrial might of the Allies began to crush the German defenders. The British and French poured millions of shells into the German lines, pulverizing their positions and forcing them to constantly counterattack to retake lost ground. The German army, already bleeding out at Verdun, was now being ground down on a second front. The elite peacetime officers and NCOs were dying at an alarming rate, replaced by hasty conscripts who lacked the training of their predecessors. Just as the situation in the West reached a breaking point, a new crisis erupted on the Eastern Front, shattering the German hope for a quiet summer in the East. General Alexei Brusilov launched a massive, innovative offensive that caught the Austro-Hungarian armies completely by surprise. Instead of the traditional long bombardment, Brusilov used a short, intense hurricane barrage followed by shock troops, collapsing the Austrian lines and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The utter disintegration of their ally forced the German High Command to strip precious divisions from the west and rush them to the east to plug the gaping hole in the line. This three-front pressure Verdun, the Somme, and the Brusilov offensive stretched the German military machine to its absolute limit. The soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms tattered, and their rations dwindling as the British naval blockade began to tighten its chokehold on the German economy at home. The superiority of Allied artillery was becoming terrifyingly apparent. German batteries were often silenced by counter-battery fire before they could even support their infantry. The skies above the trenches, once dominated by the German Fokker scourge, were now crowded with Allied aircraft that spotted for artillery and strafed the supply lines, adding a new dimension of terror to the soldiers' lives. In the midst of this carnage, the technological face of war was mutating into something even more grotesque. The British introduced the tank at the Somme, clumsy steel rhomboids that lumbered across the mud, impervious to rifle fire. While mechanically unreliable and few in number, their appearance caused panic among German troops who had no anti-tank weapons. Flamethrowers, first used by the Germans, were now a common tool of horror, turning dugouts into incinerators. The chivalry of the 19th century had been completely eradicated, replaced by an industrial process of extermination where men were mere raw materials to be consumed by the furnace of war. The strategic failure at Verdun and the crisis on the Somme ultimately cost Erich von Falkenhayn his job. The Kaiser, disillusioned by the lack of victory and the staggering casualty lists, summoned the heroes of the Eastern Front, Field Marshal Paul over Hindenburg and his brilliant quartermaster, General Erich Ludendorff. These two men took command of the German military effort in August 1916, bringing with them a ruthless efficiency and a belief in total war. They immediately recognized that Germany could not win a battle of attrition against the combined resources of the world, and ordered the construction of a massive new defensive line, the Hindenburg Line, to shorten the front and save manpower. Hindenburg and Ludendorff reorganized the German economy, essentially turning the country into a military dictatorship geared entirely towards war production. The Hindenburg program demanded a doubling of ammunition output and a tripling of artillery and machine gun production, stripping skilled workers from the factories and forcing civilians into labor service. Church bells were melted down for copper, and chemical fertilizers were diverted to make explosives, leading to a drop in agricultural yields. The entire nation was being cannibalized to feed the insatiable demands of the front, creating a dangerous brittleness in the social fabric of Germany. By the time the winter snows of 1916 began to blanket the graves of the Somme and Verdun, the German army was a changed beast. The old army of 1914, with its spikes and arrogance, was dead, buried in the mud of Flanders and France. It had been replaced by a grim, hardened force of survivors who fought with the desperation of men who knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. They had inflicted massive casualties on the Allies, but the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably against them. The grinding mill had done its work, while it had mauled the British and French. It had also ground the flower of German manhood into dust, leaving the empire hollowed out and fragile. As the year ended, a bleak realization settled over the trenches and the home front alike. The war would not be won by a brilliant maneuver or a single decisive battle. It had become a siege of Germany itself, a slow, agonizing strangulation. The soldiers in the dugouts, shivering in their thinning coats, looked towards 1917 with a mixture of fatalism and dread. They knew that the industrial slaughter of the past year was merely a prelude to greater horrors, and that their leaders, desperate to break the deadlock, were preparing to gamble the very existence of the nation on one final, reckless roll of the dice. Far away from the mud and thunder of the Western Front, a silent and invisible enemy was tightening a lethal noose around the neck of the German Empire. In the cold, grey waters of the North Sea, the ships of the British Royal Navy's 10th Cruiser Squadron patrolled the mist, enforcing a blockade that was as effective as it was distant. They did not need to fight dramatic naval battles to win the war. They simply needed to exist, intercepting merchant vessels and strangling the maritime trade upon which Germany depended. This was the Iron Ring, a strategy of economic warfare designed to starve the German war machine by cutting off the raw materials needed for industry and the food required to feed the population. Germany had entered the war as an industrial giant but an agricultural invalid, reliant on imports for nearly a third of its food supply. The British blockade ruthlessly exploited this vulnerability, expanding the definition of contraband to include foodstuffs. A controversial move that violated pre-war international laws, but was justified by the logic of total war. German ports in Hamburg and Bremen, once bustling hubs of global commerce, fell into a ghostly silence as the docks sat empty and the cranes rusted. The flow of Chilean nitrates, essential for both fertilizer and explosives, was severed, forcing German chemists to choose between feeding the guns or feeding the people. In Berlin, the new military dictatorship of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff responded to this crisis with a ruthless reorganization of German society known as the Hindenburg Program. They viewed the nation not as a collection of citizens, but as a single logistical unit dedicated to the production of violence. The Supreme Army Command, or OHL, seized control of the economy, passing the Auxiliary Service Law, which compelled all distinct males between 17 and 60 to work in war industries. Skilled farmhands were ripped from the fields and shoved into munitions factories, leaving the harvest to be managed by the elderly, women, and Russian prisoners of war. The consequences of prioritizing ammunition over agriculture became catastrophically apparent in the autumn of 1916. The chemical industry, having mastered the Haber-Bosch process to synthesize nitrogen, diverted almost all its production to the manufacture of high explosives, leaving German fields starved of fertilizer. The soil, exhausted and overworked, produced a meager harvest, while the wettest autumn in memory caused the potato crop to rot in the ground. The potato was the staple of the German diet, the caloric bedrock of the working class, and its failure signaled the beginning of a humanitarian disaster that would break the spirit of the home front. As the bitter winter of 1916 settled over the Reich, the government announced that there were no potatoes left, offering instead the Swede turnip as a substitute. This coarse root vegetable, previously used only as fodder for livestock, became the sole source of sustenance for millions of people during what became known as the turnip winter. It was a symbol of national degradation, a food fit for pigs, now served on fine porcelain in Berlin apartments. German housewives, desperate to keep their families alive, boiled it into soup, mashed it into cutlets, and even roasted it to make a bitter, mocking imitation of coffee. The physical toll of this diet was horrifying and immediate, as the caloric intake of the average civilian plummeted to less than 1,000 calories a day. The turnip provided bulk but little nutrition, leading to a widespread wasting disease that doctors grimly called turnip sickness. Civilians lost half their body weight, their skin turning a sickly grey and hanging loosely on their skeletal frames. In the unheated tenements of the cities, where coal was as scarce as food, the elderly and the young simply faded away, freezing to death in their beds or succumbing to pneumonia. The blockade was killing the most vulnerable first, waging war on grandmothers and infants. A culture of ersatz, or substitute goods, emerged to fill the void left by the blockade, creating a surreal existence where nothing was real anymore. Bread was baked with potato flour and stretched with sawdust, resulting in a dense, heavy loaf known as Käsebrot that caused severe digestive pain. Clothes were woven from paper fiber because cotton was unavailable, dissolving into pulp in the rain, while bicycle tires were replaced with metal springs that clattered loudly on the cobblestones. The German people were living in a hollowed-out shell of their former prosperity, surviving on ingenuity and illusions while their leaders promised that victory was just around the corner. The social fabric of the nation began to tear under the strain of hunger and the glaring inequality of suffering. While the working class stood in polonaises, or long food lines, for hours in the freezing sleet to receive a ladle of watery soup, the wealthy frequented the black market where butter and meat could still be bought for exorbitant prices. Resentment festered in the queues, where exhausted women cursed the war, the Kaiser, and the shark profiteers who grew fat on their misery. The Bergfrieden, the civil truce that had united all political parties at the start of the war, evaporated, replaced by the simmering anger of a population that felt betrayed by its own government. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the German army was executing a massive strategic withdrawal to cope with its own shortage of manpower. Operation Alberich was a scorched-earth retreat to the newly constructed Siegfried Line, known to the Allies as the Hindenburg Line. German engineers created a desolate buffer zone in the territory they abandoned, systematically destroying every village, bridge, and road to deny cover to the advancing Allies. They poisoned wells, cut down orchards that had stood for centuries, and planted booby traps in the ruins of farmhouses, leaving behind a wasteland that shocked the pursuing Allied troops. This retreat shortened the German front by 25 miles, freeing up 13 precious divisions to form a strategic reserve. The Hindenburg Line itself was a marvel of defensive engineering, built with forced labor and utilizing the latest concepts of elastic defense. Instead of a single trench packed with men, it was a deep zone of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and interlocking fields of fire designed to absorb an attack and then snap back with a counterstrike. It gave the German army a formidable shield behind which to hide, allowing them to hold the line with fewer men while they waited for the situation to change. However, the defensive success of the Hindenburg Line could not mask the deterioration of morale within the army itself. Soldiers returning on leave were shocked by the skeletal appearance of their wives and children. Realizing that the home front was collapsing, the flow of care packages reversed. Instead of families sending treats to the front, soldiers began sending their army rations home to keep their families from starving. This inversion undermined military discipline, as the men in the trenches began to question why they were fighting for a government that could not feed its own people. The letters they received from home were filled with despair, eroding their will to fight. The Kaiser, once the symbol of national unity, became a recluse, shielded from the reality of the crisis by his entourage. He spent his days chopping wood at his estate, increasingly irrelevant to the running of the war, while Hindenburg and Ludendorff consolidated their power. The Reichstag, the German parliament, began to stir from its slumber, with socialist deputies openly calling for a peace without annexations. The political consensus was fracturing, and the spectre of revolution, which had already toppled the Tsar in Russia, began to haunt the corridors of power in Berlin. Desperation drove the German leadership to consider the unthinkable as the year 1917 began. They knew that the army could hold the Hindenburg Line, but the home front could not survive another turnip winter. The blockade had to be broken, or Germany would implode from within before the Allies ever reached the Rhine. The naval advisors presented a seductive solution: a return to unrestricted submarine warfare. They promised that their U-boats could sink so much shipping tonnage that Britain would be starved into submission within 6 months, forcing a peace settlement before the United States could intervene. It was a cold, calculated gamble, based on statistical tables and tonnage projections that ignored the political consequences. Ludendorff and Hindenburg looked at the starving cities and the dwindling reserves and decided they had no other choice. They knew that sinking American ships would almost certainly bring the United States into the war, unleashing an industrial giant against them. Yet, they believed they were in a race against time, and that the U-boat was the only weapon that could cut the British lifeline. The order was drafted, a death warrant for the old world order. As the spring of 1917 approached, the German Empire stood on a precipice, balanced between military resilience and social collapse. The people were hungry, the army was weary, and the leadership was preparing to roll the iron dice one last time. The stranglehold of the blockade had done its work, forcing Germany into a corner where the only way out seemed to be a path of extreme escalation. The decision was made in the quiet rooms of the OHL, but its consequences would thunder across the Atlantic, awakening a sleeping giant and sealing the ultimate fate of the Reich. January 9th, 1917. The atmosphere inside the Pless Castle in Silesia was colder than the snow-covered grounds outside. This was the headquarters of the German Supreme Army Command, where the fate of the world was about to be decided in a room heavy with cigar smoke and tension. Kaiser Wilhelm II sat at the head of the table, pale and twitching with anxiety, flanked by his formidable generals, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. Across from them sat Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the Chancellor of Germany, a man who looked like a ghost haunting his own funeral. He had spent 2 years fighting against the very decision he was now being forced to accept. Knowing it would likely seal the doom of the empire, The topic on the table was the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, a strategy that authorized German U-boats to sink any ship, neutral or belligerent, found in the waters around the British Isles. The Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf, presented his case with the confidence of a mathematician solving a simple equation. He promised the Kaiser that his submarines could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, a rate of attrition that would force Britain to sue for peace within 5 months. When the Chancellor raised the spectre of American intervention, the Admiral waved his hand dismissively, guaranteeing that not a single American soldier will land on the continent before Britain surrendered. With a trembling hand, the Kaiser signed the order, effective February 1st, 1917. It was a desperate gamble. A Flucht nach vorn, a flight forward born of the realization that Germany was slowly losing the war of attrition on land. The orders were flashed via wireless to the U-boat pens in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, where captains began loading their vessels with torpedoes and provisions for long patrols. These steel sharks slipped out into the North Sea, their crews knowing that the rules of engagement had been discarded. They were now hunters with a license to kill anything that moved on the surface of the Atlantic. The effects were immediate and devastating, unleashing a second happy time for the German submarine commanders. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, merchant sailors lived in constant terror of the white wake of a torpedo or the sudden surfacing of a U-boat. Ships were blown apart without warning, sending thousands of tons of grain, ammunition, and raw materials to the bottom of the ocean. By April, the U-boats had exceeded Holtzendorf's wildest predictions, sinking over 860,000 tons of shipping in a single month. The British Isles, dependent on imports for survival, began to starve, with wheat reserves plummeting to a critical 6-week supply. In London, the mood was one of suppressed panic. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Jellicoe, confessed to the government that the war would be lost by November if the sinkings continued at the current rate. The German strategy was working with terrifying efficiency, tightening the noose around the British neck just as the blockade had done to Germany. However, every ship sunk brought the United States closer to the brink of war. American merchant vessels, once safe under the flag of neutrality, began to disappear beneath the waves, taking American lives with them. President Woodrow Wilson watched with growing fury as his diplomatic protests were ignored by a German leadership that had decided to accept war with America as the cost of doing business. While the U-boats did their deadly work, the German Foreign Office committed a blunder of such colossal stupidity that it accelerated their own destruction. Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary, devised a plan to distract the United States by igniting a war on its southern border. He sent an encoded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico City, proposing a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. In exchange for Mexican support, Germany promised to help Mexico reconquer its lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. It was a fantasy born of ignorance about the geopolitical realities of the Americas, but its impact would be all too real. British naval intelligence, operating out of the secretive room 40 inches, the old Admiralty building, intercepted the message. Codebreakers like Nigel de Grey worked tirelessly to decrypt the cipher, and when the plain text was revealed, they could hardly believe their eyes. The British government held the Zimmermann telegram like a winning poker hand, waiting for the perfect moment to play it. They released the text to the American press on March 1st, causing an explosion of anti-German sentiment across the United States. The idea of German Pickelhaubes marching through Texas shattered the isolationist stance of the American public overnight. President Wilson, who had campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," found he had no room left to maneuver. On April 2nd, 1917, he stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against the German Empire. He framed the conflict not merely as a defense of shipping rights, but as a crusade for civilization itself, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States officially entered the war. Germany had won its bet that America could not intervene immediately, but they had awakened an industrial giant with resources that dwarfed the combined might of the Central Powers. The entry of the United States fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the war. While the American army was initially small and untrained, its potential was limitless. The U.S. Navy immediately dispatched destroyers to the Atlantic to assist the Royal Navy in hunting U-boats. More importantly, the Allies finally adopted the convoy system, grouping merchant ships together under the protection of warships. The Wolf now had to attack a defended flock, and U-boat losses began to mount. The curve of sinkings flattened and then began to drop, and the spectre of British starvation receded. The German gamble to win the war at sea had failed. While the door to victory closed in the west, a window suddenly smashed open in the east. The Russian Empire, exhausted by 3 years of slaughter and internal rot, collapsed under the weight of revolution. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The provisional government that replaced him vowed to continue the war. But the Russian army was disintegrating. Soldiers deserted by the millions. Shooting their officers and walking home to seize land, the German High Command saw an opportunity to knock Russia out of the war completely and free up their eastern armies for the Western Front. In a move of Machiavellian brilliance, the German government decided to transport a weapon more potent than any poison gas into the heart of Russia. They located the exiled Bolshevik revolutionary Vladimir Lenin living in Zurich and offered him safe passage across Germany. Ludendorff hoped that Lenin would act like a plague bacillus, infecting the Russian body politic with chaos and forcing a separate peace. Lenin boarded a sealed train that carried him across Germany to the Baltic coast, eventually arriving at the Finland station in Petrograd to thunderous applause. The gamble paid off spectacularly. By November 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks had seized power in the October Revolution, overthrowing the provisional government and immediately calling for an end to the war. The Eastern Front effectively ceased to exist. German soldiers and Russian revolutionaries met in no man's land not to kill, but to embrace and trade schnapps for tobacco. The cessation of hostilities allowed Germany to occupy vast swathes of territory in Ukraine and the Baltic states, securing grain and resources that were desperately needed at home. Formal peace negotiations began at the fortress of Brest-Litovsk, where the Germans dictated terms to the Bolshevik delegation with the arrogance of conquerors. The resulting treaty was harsh, stripping Russia of 1/3 of its population and half of its industry. But it achieved the primary German objective, the end of the two-front war. For the first time since 1914, Germany could focus its entire military might on a single enemy. The trains began to roll westward, carrying hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened veterans from the snows of Russia to the mud of France. However, the race was now tighter than ever. The German High Command knew that the collapse of Russia gave them a temporary numerical superiority in the West. But this advantage was a wasting asset. Every day, thousands of fresh American doughboys were arriving in French ports, eager to fight. The German soldiers transferring from the East were tired, hungry, and politically radicalized by their contact with the Bolsheviks. The home front was crumbling under the blockade, and the Allies were producing tanks and aircraft in numbers Germany could not hope to match. As 1917 drew to a close, the German Empire found itself in a paradoxical position. They had achieved a monumental victory in the East, defeating one of their greatest enemies, yet they were closer to defeat than ever in the West. The submarine campaign had failed to strangle Britain and had instead brought the infinite resources of America into the fight. Hindenburg and Ludendorff looked at the map and realized they had one last card to play. They had to use their temporary advantage to launch a decisive, war-winning offensive in France before the American army was fully deployed. The stage was set for the final showdown of the Great War. It would be a race between the speed of the German stormtroopers and the logistics of the American arrival. The German people, starving and exhausted, were told to hold on for one last effort. The peace offensive was being prepared, a massive strike designed to break the Allied line and end the war on German terms. In the muddy trenches of the Western Front, the soldiers cleaned their rifles and waited for the spring, knowing that the coming battle would decide whether they returned home as victors or whether the German Empire would cease to exist. Throughout the freezing nights of early 1918, the rail lines of Germany groaned under the weight of a massive migration that would decide the fate of the war. Train after train arrived from the conquered east, disgorging hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the staging areas behind the Western Front. These men were the victors of Russia, hardened veterans who brought with them the hope of the entire nation, now freed from the two-front nightmare. They were being assembled for the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle, a colossal offensive designed to smash the British army before the Americans could arrive in force. For the first time since 1914, Germany possessed a numerical superiority in the West, amassing nearly 200 divisions for one final, titanic throw of the dice. Leading this assault were the Stoßtruppen, or stormtroopers, a new breed of soldier trained in revolutionary infiltration tactics designed to break the deadlock of the trenches. Unlike the rigid lines of the past, these elite units operated in small, flexible groups armed with bags of grenades, sharpened shovels, and the new MP-18 submachine guns. Their orders were to bypass enemy strongpoints, leaving them for the following waves of heavy infantry, and to push deep into the enemy rear to destroy command posts and artillery batteries. They were the tip of the spear, young and physically fit men selected from the best units, fed on double rations while the rest of the army starved, carrying the burden of victory on their shoulders. General Erich Ludendorff sat before his maps in the Hotel Britannique in Spa, plotting the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force with a gambler's desperation. His strategy for Operation Michael was to strike at the junction between the French and British armies near Saint-Quentin, aiming to drive a wedge between the Allies and push the British into the sea. It was a plan of staggering ambition, relying not on limited objectives, but on the momentum of the attack itself to dictate the outcome. Ludendorff famously remarked, "We punch a hole and let the rest follow," a philosophy that prioritized tactical violence over clear strategic goals, risking total chaos if the initial punch failed to deliver a knockout blow. At exactly 4:40 a.m. on March 21, 1918, the sky over Picardy exploded with a violence that registered on seismographs in London. Over 6,000 German guns and 3,000 mortars opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a hurricane of steel and gas that dwarfed any bombardment in history. This was not the week-long pounding of the Somme, but a short, scientifically calculated suppression designed by Colonel Georg Bruchmüller. He mixed tear gas with lethal phosgene, forcing the British defenders to remove their masks to vomit, only to inhale the deadly agents. The Bruchmüller symphony shattered the British communication lines and stunned the defenders in their dugouts, rendering them deaf and blind before the infantry even left their trenches. Nature itself seemed to conspire with the Germans as a dense, white fog rolled across the battlefield, reducing visibility to a few yards and hiding the attackers. At 9:40 a.m., the stormtroopers rose from their positions and vanished into the mist. Moving like ghosts toward the British lines, the British machine gunners, blinded by the fog and the smoke, fired wildly into the grey void, unable to see the targets that were already flanking them. The German assault groups cut the wire and infiltrated the trench systems, appearing suddenly out of the gloom to terrorize headquarters, staff and artillery crews who believed the front line was still intact miles away. The terror of the invisible enemy caused a panic that spread like a virus. The results were catastrophic for the British Fifth Army under General Hubert Gough, whose defensive lines evaporated by noon. The British troops were in full retreat, abandoning their guns and equipment in a desperate bid to escape the encirclement, creating a gap in the line 40 miles wide. For the first time in 4 years of static warfare, the stalemate was broken, and the war of movement had returned. The German infantry surged forward into open country, capturing more ground in a single day than the Allies had managed in months of fighting at the Somme or Passchendaele. The roads were clogged with fleeing British units, and panic began to ripple all the way back to London as the scale of the disaster became apparent. As the Germans advanced across the old battlefields of the Somme, the landscape changed from the pristine green of the rear to the cratered wasteland of 1916. The speed of the advance began to work against them, as the infantry outran their supply wagons and field kitchens, leaving them hungry and low on ammunition. The heavy artillery, drawn by horses that were starving and weak from the fodder shortage, struggled to keep pace with the stormtroopers, leaving the leading elements without fire support. The ground itself, churned into a morass of mud and shell holes by years of previous fighting, acted as a brake on the German momentum, slowing the Michael offensive just as it needed to accelerate to secure a decisive victory. The advance also revealed a devastating truth to the starving German soldiers: the enemy was not collapsing from a lack of supplies. When the stormtroopers overran British supply depots, they found mountains of corned beef, white bread, jam, and cigarettes, luxuries they had not seen in years. Discipline broke down as hungry men stopped to gorge themselves on the spoils of war. Drunk on captured rum and wine, the realization that the British were well fed and fully equipped, while their own families ate turnips, shattered the illusion of German superiority. They were winning the battle, but the material abundance of the Allies gnawed at their will to fight, planting the seeds of doubt in the minds of the victors. Despite the tactical success, the strategic picture remained blurry for Ludendorff, whose command style began to oscillate between brilliance and indecision. The British line had bent and broken in places, but it had not snapped completely, and reserves were rushing to plug the gaps. Instead of focusing all his reserves on the critical railway hub of Amiens, which would have severed the link between the British and French, Ludendorff vacillated. He ordered attacks in divergent directions, dissipating the strength of the German punch. The Michael offensive began to lose its focus, turning into a series of disjointed battles rather than a decisive stroke. The window of opportunity was closing, and the German army was bleeding its best men to keep it open. Frustrated by the slowing momentum near Amiens, Ludendorff launched a second offensive in the north, codenamed Georgette, targeting the Lys River Valley in April. The attack struck a sector held by exhausted British troops and a Portuguese division that was ill-equipped for the onslaught. Once again, the German stormtroopers achieved a breakthrough, pushing the British back to within miles of the vital Channel ports. The situation was so dire that Field Marshal Douglas Haig issued his famous backs-to-the-wall order, commanding his troops to fight to the last man. The British line, held by a thread, stabilized only by the desperate courage of individual units and the arrival of French reinforcements who were rushed north. As the German offensives ground on into May and June, a new and ominous presence appeared on the battlefield to confront the weary attackers. At the Battle of Cantigny and later at Belleau Wood, German troops encountered the Americans for the first time in significant numbers. They were raw and tactically naive, advancing in dense columns that were easily mown down by machine guns. But they fought with a terrifying aggression and energy that the tired Europeans had lost. More importantly, there were endless numbers of them. For every American killed, 10 more seemed to take his place. The German commanders realized with horror that they were no longer fighting a finite enemy. They were fighting a tide that would never stop rising. Ludendorff tried once more in June with Operation Gneisenau along the Matz River, attempting to draw French reserves away from the north. But by now, the Allies had learned the new German tactics and developed countermeasures. The element of surprise was gone. The French, utilizing a deep defense strategy, allowed the Germans to advance into a kill zone before unleashing a devastating counterattack with tanks. The German advance was stopped dead in its tracks after only a few miles. The formula that had worked so brilliantly in March was now yielding diminishing returns, costing thousands of lives for insignificant strips of territory that held no strategic value. By the summer of 1918, the German army was a shadow of the force that had launched the spring offensives with such high hopes. The elite stormtrooper units had suffered horrific casualties, losing the most aggressive and capable leaders who could not be replaced. The remaining infantry divisions were filled with older men, returned wounded, and disillusioned teenagers who lacked the training of their predecessors. The Spanish flu began to ravage the ranks, striking down soldiers whose immune systems were weakened by malnutrition. The offensive spirit had burned out, replaced by a sullen resignation. They had marched and fought for months, capturing vast swathes of France, yet the war was no closer to ending. The final German gasp came in mid-July at the Second Battle of the Marne, a desperate attempt to break the French line. Ludendorff ordered a massive attack to encircle Reims, believing one last push would force the French to the negotiating table. The attack was a disaster. French intelligence had learned of the exact time of the assault, and the German troops walked into a trap. The Allied artillery opened fire on the assembly trenches before the German bombardment even began, slaughtering the assault waves before they could leave their positions. The attack collapsed within days, marking the high water mark of the German advance and the end of their offensive capability. On July 18, 1918, the initiative shifted irrevocably to the Allies. French General Ferdinand Foch, now the Supreme Allied Commander, launched a massive counter-offensive into the flank of the exhausted German salient. Spearheaded by hundreds of Renault FT tanks and swarms of aircraft, the French and American troops smashed through the German lines. The German soldiers, who had spent 4 months on the attack, were caught off guard and forced to retreat. The hunters had become the hunted. The realization spread through the German ranks that the gamble had failed. They had spent their last reserves, and now they had nothing left to stop the storm that was coming for them. The psychological impact of the failure was more damaging than the loss of territory, breaking the spirit of the army. The German soldier had been promised that the Emperor's battle would bring victory and peace before the autumn. Instead, it had brought only death and the revelation of the enemy's overwhelming strength. The trust between the leadership and the troops began to fracture. As they retreated back across the cratered fields of the Marne, leaving their dead behind, a dark mood settled over the army. They were not beaten yet, but the shadow of defeat was lengthening, stretching all the way back to the borders of the Reich. August 8, 1918, 4:20 a.m. A dense fog blanketed the Santerre plateau east of Amiens, creating a ghostly silence that muffled the sounds of the night. In the forward trenches, German sentries peered nervously into the milky whiteness, listening for the telltale clinking of equipment that usually signaled an infantry raid. Instead, they heard a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, growing louder and more mechanical with every passing second. It was the sound of 400 Allied tanks, their engines roaring in unison, creeping forward under the cover of the mist like prehistoric beasts. For the exhausted soldiers of the German Second Army, this auditory hallucination was the herald of their doom, marking the beginning of the end for the Imperial German Army. Without a preliminary bombardment to warn the defenders, the Allied artillery opened fire with a sudden, thunderous crash that instantly severed German communications and pinned the infantry in their dugouts. Behind this creeping barrage, the Canadian and Australian Corps, the shock troops of the British Empire, surged forward with terrifying speed. They were supported by the Mark V heavy tanks and the faster Whippet medium tanks, which crushed the barbed wire and rolled over the machine gun nests that had stymied infantry for 4 years. The German defensive scheme, which relied on depth and elastic response, collapsed within hours as the steel monsters rampaged through the rear areas, destroying artillery batteries and sowing panic among the staff officers. By noon, the Allied forces had punched a hole 15 miles wide in the German line, advancing 7 miles deep into enemy territory, a feat that had previously taken months to achieve. The German divisional commanders lost all contact with their regiments, and entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot. Overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the combined arms assault, General Erich Ludendorff, receiving fragmented reports at his headquarters, was stunned not by the tactical loss of ground, but by the manner in which it was lost. He listened with horror to accounts of retiring troops shouting insults at reinforcements moving up to the front, calling them blacklegs and war prolongers, a terminology borrowed from industrial strikes. This day, August 8th, was immortalized by Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German Army. It marked the psychological breaking point where the soldiers' will to fight finally snapped under the weight of accumulated misery and the realization of defeat. The illusion of invincibility, nurtured by the spring offensives, was replaced by a collective hopelessness. Soldiers who had endured the hell of Verdun and the Somme now threw down their rifles at the sight of a tank, seeing no honor in dying for a lost cause. The contagion of defeatism spread rapidly from the front lines to the rear echelons, where the administrative machinery of the army began to grind to a halt amidst the chaos of retreat. Sensing that the German beast was wounded, the Supreme Allied Commander, Ferdinand Foch, ordered a relentless expansion of the offensive, refusing to give the enemy a moment to regroup. His strategy, characterized by the phrase, tout le monde à la bataille, everyone to the battle, involved hitting the German line at different points in rapid succession. As soon as the German reserves rushed to plug a breach in one sector, the Allies would strike in another, stretching the depleted German manpower to the breaking point. The British Third Army attacked at Albert, the French First Army struck at Noyon, and the British First Army pushed toward Arras. The German army was no longer fighting a coherent defensive battle, it was merely trying to survive the day. Throughout late August and September, the German armies were forced into a fighting withdrawal back toward the Hindenburg Line. The massive defensive fortification they believed would be their salvation. The retreat was a grim affair, conducted through a landscape of burning villages and destroyed bridges, as German engineers desperately tried to slow the Allied advance with scorched earth tactics. However, the discipline that had once been the hallmark of the Prussian soldier was fraying. Officers were ignored or openly defied, and looting of their own supply depots became common. The men were hungry, their uniforms were in rags, and the letters from home spoke only of starvation and the Spanish flu, which was now claiming thousands of lives in the cities. On September 12th, the Americans launched their first independent offensive at Saint-Mihiel, attacking a salient that had protruded into the Allied lines since 1914. While the Germans had already begun to evacuate the area, the speed and scale of the American attack, supported by nearly 1,500 aircraft, caught them off balance. The sheer number of fresh American troops, eager and seemingly infinite, had a devastating effect on German morale. A German officer, watching the endless columns of doughboys pouring toward the front, wrote in his diary that it felt as if the entire world had mobilized against them. The realization that they could kill 10 Americans, only to see 20 more take their place, drained the last reserves of fighting spirit. The final hope of the German High Command lay in the Hindenburg Line, a formidable system of concrete bunkers, deep belts of barbed wire, and the impassable St. Quentin Canal. Ludendorff believed that if his armies could retreat behind this shield, they could hold out through the winter and negotiate a favorable peace. But on September 29th, that hope was shattered. British, Australian, and American troops, utilizing bridging tanks and swimming across the canal in life jackets, stormed the impregnable defenses. They cracked the Hindenburg Line open, proving that no physical barrier could stop the Allied juggernaut. The last line of defense was gone, and the road to Germany lay open. Back at the Supreme Headquarters in Spa, Belgium, the nerve of General Erich Ludendorff finally collapsed. The man who had virtually ruled Germany as a dictator for 2 years began to exhibit signs of a nervous breakdown, oscillating between fits of rage and paralyzing depression. On the evening of September 28th, as reports of the impending breakthrough poured in, he fell to the floor, foaming at the mouth and shouting about the betrayal of the army. He realized that the military situation was irretrievable and that a total collapse of the front was imminent. He summoned Hindenburg and told him the grim truth: the war must be ended immediately, or the army would be annihilated in the field. The panic at headquarters precipitated a political earthquake in Berlin. To facilitate peace negotiations, Ludendorff and Hindenburg suddenly demanded that power be transferred to a civilian government, hoping to shift the blame for the defeat onto democratic politicians. They advised the Kaiser to appoint Prince Max of Baden, a liberal aristocrat known for his humanitarian work, as the new chancellor. This cynical maneuver was designed to preserve the reputation of the army by handing over the reins of power at the moment of defeat. The generals ensured that it would be the civilians, not the military, who would have to sign the surrender. This was the birth of the stab-in-the-back myth, a lie planted before the war had even ended. On October 3rd, Prince Max sent a note to President Woodrow Wilson, requesting an armistice based on the 14 points, a set of principles for peace that Wilson had outlined earlier in the year. The German leadership hoped for a peace without victory, a lenient settlement that would leave the German Reich intact. However, the exchange of diplomatic notes dragged on for weeks, as Wilson demanded the abdication of the Kaiser and the dismantling of the German military autocracy as a precondition for peace. While the diplomats argued, the soldiers continued to die. The Allied pressure on the Western Front did not let up. With the Meuse-Argonne offensive grinding slowly but inexorably toward the vital railway lines that supplied the German army. By late October, the German army was a broken skeleton of its former self. The strength of the battalions had fallen to below 50%, and there were no reserves left to replace the losses. The artillery, the backbone of the German defense, was running out of shells and losing its guns to the advancing Allies at an alarming rate. The roads leading back to Germany were clogged with retreating columns, wounded men, and stolen cattle, creating a picture of an army dissolving into a rabble. Yet, miraculously, the front line did not completely disintegrate. Small groups of machine gunners and die-hard veterans continued to fight rearguard actions, exacting a heavy price for every mile of ground the Allies gained. However, the rot had spread far beyond the battlefield. Inside Germany, the civilian population was on the brink of revolution. The blockade had reduced the daily bread ration to a few ounces of sawdust-filled loaf, and the turnip harvest was failing again. The Spanish flu was tearing through the malnourished population, killing thousands every day in the overcrowded tenements of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The people watched the military bulletins with growing disbelief, realizing they had been lied to for years about the certainty of victory. The social contract between the Kaiser and his subjects, held together by the promise of triumph, dissolved into anger and resentment. As the negotiations with Wilson stalled over the fate of the Kaiser, the German Naval Command decided to intervene with a suicidal act of defiance. Admiral Reinhard Scheer and his staff, unwilling to surrender their fleet without a fight, planned a final sortie into the North Sea. The order was given for the High Seas Fleet, which had sat idle in port since Jutland, to steam out and engage the British Royal Navy in a glorious death ride. They believed that even if the fleet was destroyed, it would restore the honour of the Navy and perhaps improve Germany's bargaining position. It was a decision made by officers who were completely out of touch with the mood of their sailors. On October 29th, in the naval port of Wilhelmshaven, the stokers and sailors on the battleships refused to obey the order to raise steam. They extinguished the boiler fires and arrested their officers, raising the red flag of revolution on the masts of the Kaiser's dreadnoughts. This mutiny was not just a refusal to die for a lost cause, it was the spark that would ignite a powder keg. The sailors did not just want to stop the suicide mission, they wanted to stop the war and overthrow the system that had created it. The Black Day of the Army had led to the Red Days of the Revolution. The war was no longer just being lost on the front lines. The German Empire was about to be destroyed from within. The spark that ignited in the naval yards of Wilhelmshaven did not remain contained within the iron hulls of the High Seas Fleet. By the first week of November 1918, the mutiny had transformed into a wildfire of revolution that swept through the German interior with the speed of a locomotive. Heavily armed sailors, wearing red armbands and carrying rifles reversed over their shoulders, boarded trains and spread out across the country, acting as the apostles of insurrection. In Hamburg, Hanover, and Cologne, they were met not by police resistance, but by cheering crowds of workers who were starving and desperate for change. The old order, rigid and brittle, simply snapped under the pressure, and the imperial authorities found themselves powerless as workers' and soldiers' councils seized control of city halls and barracks, mimicking the Soviet model that had toppled the Tsar in Russia. In Munich, the heart of conservative Bavaria, the revolution took on a surreal and almost bloodless character on November 7th. Kurt Eisner, a Jewish journalist with a wild grey beard and a straw hat, led a massive demonstration through the streets that dissolved the monarchy of the Wittelsbach dynasty, which had ruled for 700 years. King Ludwig III fled the city under the cover of darkness, his car stripped of its royal insignias. As Eisner proclaimed the Free State of Bavaria, the swiftness of the collapse stunned the nation. There were no loyal regiments left to defend the kings and princes. The German Empire was dissolving into a loose federation of revolutionary republics, and the red flag now flew over the castles of the aristocracy. Meanwhile, at the supreme headquarters in Spa, Belgium, Kaiser Wilhelm II remained trapped in a delusional bubble. Isolated from the crumbling reality of his empire, he paced the floors of the Château de la Franeuse, furiously studying maps and fantasizing about leading his army back to Berlin to crush the rebellion. He ordered his generals to prepare plans for a civil war, believing that the soldiers, bound to him by their personal oath of allegiance, would turn their guns on their own fathers and brothers. His advisers listened in uncomfortable silence, knowing that the phone lines to Berlin were bringing news of a capital city on the verge of total anarchy. The Kaiser was no longer the supreme warlord. He was a man shouting orders at a ghost army. The shattering dose of reality was delivered by General Wilhelm Gruner, Ludendorff's successor, on the grey morning of November 9th, standing before the Emperor. Gruner delivered one of the most devastating lines in German history: "Sire, you no longer have an army. The army will march home in peace and order under its leaders and commanding generals, but not under the command of your Majesty." When the Kaiser protested, citing the soldier's oath, Gruner replied coldly, "The oath is a fiction." At that moment, the divine right of kings clashed with the pragmatic reality of a modern, exhausted conscript army. The Kaiser turned pale, realizing that the instrument of his power had finally broken in his hands. In Berlin, the situation had reached a boiling point as hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike, marching toward the Reichstag and the Imperial Palace. Prince Max of Baden, the Chancellor, realized that unless the Kaiser abdicated immediately, the moderate socialists would lose control to the radical communists, plunging Germany into a Bolshevik bloodbath. Desperate to save the country from civil war, Prince Max took matters into his own hands. Without waiting for confirmation from Spa, he released a press statement announcing that the Kaiser and the Crown Prince had abdicated. He then handed over the chancellorship to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Social Democrats, a former saddler who now held the fate of Germany in his hands. The news of the abdication spread through Berlin like an electric shock, but the political chaos was far from over. Philipp Scheidemann, a leading Social Democrat, was eating lunch in the Reichstag when he was told that the communist leader Karl Liebknecht was planning to proclaim a socialist republic from the balcony of the Imperial Palace. Determined to preempt the radicals, Scheidemann rushed to a window of the Reichstag and shouted to the massive crowd below, "The old and rotten. The monarchy has collapsed. Long live the new, long live the German Republic." With those impromptu words, the German Empire was formally buried, and a fragile democracy was born amidst the turmoil of defeat and revolution. While the politicians in Berlin scrambled to build a government, a small German delegation led by Matthias Erzberger was travelling through the ravaged landscape of northern France to negotiate the terms of surrender. They were taken to a secluded clearing in the forest of Compiègne, where the personal train of Marshal Ferdinand Foch was waiting on a railway siding. The atmosphere inside the carriage was icy. Foch did not greet them as equals but as vanquished foes. He sat like a stone statue, flanked by British and French officers, and asked, "What do you want?" "Gentlemen." When Erzberger replied that they had come to receive the Allied proposals, Foch snapped, "I have no proposals to make." The document that Foch eventually pushed across the table was not a peace treaty, but a list of demands that amounted to total military emasculation. The Allies demanded the immediate evacuation of all occupied territories, the surrender of the entire submarine fleet, and the handing over of massive quantities of artillery, machine guns, and locomotives. Most cruelly, the naval blockade would remain in place until a final peace treaty was signed, meaning that Germany would continue to starve even after the fighting stopped. Erzberger, shocked by the severity of the terms, pleaded for leniency, pointing out that the German people were dying of hunger and that chaos would ensue. Foch remained unmoved, replying simply, "War is war." Back at Spa, the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, now a private citizen with nowhere to go, waited on a railway platform for his train to exile. His request to remain in Germany as a private citizen had been rejected by the new government, who feared his presence would ignite a civil war. In the early hours of November 10th, the imperial train crossed the border into the neutral Netherlands. The Dutch border guards, bewildered by the arrival of the man who had been the most powerful monarch in Europe, allowed him to pass. Wilhelm II, the man whose ambition had helped set the world on fire, disappeared into the fog of history, leaving behind a ruined nation and millions of graves. In the railway carriage at Compiègne, the clock ticked down the final hours of the war. With no other options and the threat of a full-scale Allied invasion looming, Erzberger received authorization from Berlin to sign the armistice. At 5:10 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the signatures were affixed to the document. The order was sent out to all commanders. Hostilities would cease at 11:00 a.m. There were still 6 hours left to kill. In a final act of tragic futility, some Allied commanders ordered their troops to attack until the very last minute to capture symbolic ground or improve their positions. Men died at 10:55 a.m. for land they would walk away from an hour later. As the hands of the watch approached the 11th hour, a strange phenomenon occurred along the hundreds of miles of the Western Front. The artillery fire, which had been a constant, thundering backdrop to life for 4 years, intensified in a final, spasmodic crescendo. Both sides emptied their magazines and fired their last shells, a furious venting of rage and ammunition. Then, as the second hand hit the 12, the guns stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, physical, and terrifying. Men who had lived with the noise of war for so long reported that the sudden quiet felt like a blow to the chest, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. Slowly, tentatively, heads began to pop up above the parapets. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only a stunned disbelief. German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, standing in the open for the first time in years without fear of being shot. Across no man's land, British, French, and American troops did the same. They stared at each other, not as monsters, but as dirty, exhausted men. In some sectors, they met in the middle to exchange cigarettes and souvenirs. In others, they simply turned their backs and walked away, too drained for gestures of reconciliation. The war was over, but the world they had known was gone, destroyed by the violence they had unleashed. The march home for the German army was a bitter procession. They returned not as a conquered rabble, but in formed columns, with flags flying and bands playing, maintaining a facade of discipline. When they arrived in Berlin, Friedrich Ebert greeted them at the Brandenburg Gate with the fateful words, "No enemy has vanquished you." It was a political lie meant to soothe the pride of the soldiers, but it planted a poisonous seed. If the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, then why was the war lost? The answer, whispered by unrepentant generals like Ludendorff, was that they had been betrayed by traitors at home socialists, Jews, and Democrats who had stabbed them in the back. The Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back myth, took root immediately in the fertile soil of national humiliation. The German people, who had been told they were winning until the very end, could not comprehend the sudden collapse. They looked for scapegoats, and the military leadership was all too happy to provide them. The Republic, born in the ashes of defeat, was branded as the November criminals, tainted by the shame of the armistice. While the soldiers returned to a country racked by hunger, inflation, and street fighting, the resentment began to curdle into a desire for revenge. The war had ended, but the peace was built on a foundation of lies and hatred. In a military hospital in Pacewalk, a corporal named Adolf Hitler lay temporarily blinded by a British gas attack. When the pastor arrived to tell the patients that the Kaiser had abdicated and the war was lost, Hitler collapsed on his bed and wept. In his delirium, he swore an oath to avenge the betrayal of the fatherland and to undo the shame of November 1918. He was just one of millions of angry, disillusioned men drifting through the wreckage of the Reich. But his rage would eventually harness the dark energy of the defeat. The First World War had ended, but in the silence of the armistice, the ticking clock for the next global catastrophe had already begun.